The long-awaited moment had arrived. Almost a year of planning had gone into the planning of this trip. A trip to Harare in February had been necessary to purchase the hunt on a public auction. And finally, now in June, here we were in Pretoria, all three members of the party, all three families gathering in Pretoria, making the last adjustments and checking on those checklists, making quite sure that every last item of equipment was there and was packed in, as not much was available in Zimbabwe. And then off on the Great North Road, through to Petersburg and further north, the Great North Road leading ever north and eventually bringing us to the Tropic of Capricorn. Very interesting stopping point for us, where we were able to read there on the brass plaque just why and how the Tropic of Capricorn is positioned just there at that spot on the road. From there we crossed over the border at Bight Bridge into Zimbabwe. The ideal opportunity for a fuel stop and a good look at the map of Zimbabwe, where we of course were entering at the southern portion at Bight Bridge, and from there we would do another leg to this Great Zimbabwe ruins that was formerly known, now known as Great Zimbabwe. Most fascinating place where we felt it was worthwhile to stop for a few hours. And all members of the party were able to have a good look at this very impressive ruin and also read some of the theories as to its origin. And of course the most modern theory is that it was all built by local black Zimbabweans. We of course could see the reasoning behind that theory, but we found it a little difficult to swallow. And what I found most interesting was the chevron effect on the tops of the walls, of the stone walls, was the same chevron effect that I had seen in north of Britain. Beautiful stonework wherever one looked. From there, of course, a further leg to Harare, where it had all started with me attending the auction and purchasing our hunt. We experienced tremendous hospitality here in Harare, and we had an overnight stop. From there we traveled west down to Lake Kariba and to Marongora, which is the Parks and Wildlife entrance into the valley, the place where we registered, obtained all our permits, and this was now our springboard to the Zambezi valley itself. At the escarpment, of course, we stopped and we spent quite a while just looking down into this beautiful valley which was to be our home for the next 2 weeks. On the way down, within no time at all, we were treated to a glimpse of a beautiful tusker, just a magnificent animal as he crossed the road and into the bush. From there, from the tarred road, we turned off toward the river through our hunting area, and from there onwards we were in four-wheel drive country. Sand track through the bush, four-wheel drive country. And we were really on our own. The rest of the party had gone ahead with Wellington, our guide, and we followed behind. And eventually the Zambezi River. We had a lunch stop there, and this was really, for some of the members of our party, the first time they'd seen the Zambezi River, and looking across at Zambia on the other side, just a memorable occasion. Just a beautiful river, beautiful clean water flowing all the way down to the Indian Ocean through Mozambique to the east. From this lunch stop, of course, back onto the four-wheel drive tracks to our camp, which was not that far away. E-Camp, which is the camp which we had for 2 weeks, is the camp situated closest to Mana Pools Game Reserve. The meaning of the word attaching to this E-Camp, Chibondo, means lions, because the original inhabitants in this area were often eaten by lions, and that is what the name basically signifies. And we were to find that this certainly was a well-named area. Our camp at last, under a beautiful acacia tree, Acacia albaida, favorite food of the elephants, one of the most beautiful trees in the Zambezi Valley. And no time was lost before the sun set in sighting in our weapons for the hunt, because the following day was to be our first hunting day. This day, the day of our arrival, was a non-hunting day, and all under the watchful eye of Wellington, our guard supplied by the national parks. Carl and I both sighted in our medium caliber and heavy caliber rifles, and we were happy to see that the long journey hadn't disturbed them in any way at all, and they were both zeroed to our satisfaction. As next day we were not prepared for any mistakes, rifles not zeroed correctly. That night was our first sunset on the Zambezi. Just a beautiful sunset, and of course there's a local legend that once you've experienced sunset on the Zambezi Valley, you will always come back again to see those sunsets on the Zambezi River. And this has certainly been our experience. Next morning, of course, the first business of the day next morning was camp meat. And we wasted no time early in the morning, and we shot our first few impala so that the camp would have meat. After that, we were able to spend a bit of time having a look around our hunting area to see just where the hippo were and just where all the animals were situated. As we had buffalo, I had 2 buffalo on my permit, Carl had a hippo, and I had a hyena, apart from numerous other antelope. To our absolute amazement and surprise, that same morning we came across a herd of 3 buffalo males. And after a stalk across very difficult open ground, I was very fortunate to be able to stalk to within range of a magnificent buffalo bull. And on the very first day of our hunt, I was privileged to shoot through the heart my first trophy buffalo, which turned out to be a 41.5-inch horned animal. This was truly a stroke of luck, because anything over 38 inches is regarded as an acceptable trophy in the valley. 40 inches is a good trophy, and 41.5 inches certainly an excellent trophy. Once the animal had been shot and had been bled, then the laborious business of turning it over to its most photogenic side began, and we found that moving an animal of this size certainly took some strength and some determination. Eventually, however, with Carl's expertise and no doubt Wellington's helping in the rear end there, we were able to get the animal set up, and it certainly was a most memorable occasion, and quite a few photographs were taken on this particular occasion. After a long wait of an hour and a half or so, Carl and Wellington were able to fetch the vehicle and get close enough for us to start the intricate loading operation. We were fortunate to find a nearby donga, and we attached a chain to the buffalo and dragged them to the edge of the donga, and after quite some effort were able to get the buffalo loaded up and eventually back to camp. On the way back to camp, we saw our first hyena, and I in fact was able to shoot the hyena, but we weren't able to retrieve him as it was getting a little bit late, so we had to leave him that night. Getting back to the camp that night, we gutted the buffalo as we couldn't leave the entrails in overnight. Next morning, early, the serious business of caping him for a trophy began. Carl, of course, being professional, was the expert, and I was very happy to leave it to him, as I knew he would do an excellent job. We left Carl and the skinning team in camp, attending to that operation, and we went out and retrieved the hyena, a very, very old man. His teeth were completely worn away and his fur was almost bare. We did him a favor in putting him out of his misery. The result, of course, was that he wasn't a worthwhile trophy, and I never brought him home as a trophy. Carl did, in fact, take his skull for one of his American clients who was very keen to have a hyena skull. But this old man was very happily put out of his misery. When we got back to camp, the idea was to catch wundu, because this is a very good fishing spot for wundu, and wundu of up to 80 or 100 pounds are often caught here. But on this occasion, the crocodiles were so numerous that all that we hooked into were crocodiles, and we soon stopped that. We didn't see any joy in hooking crocodiles, so we stopped fishing for wundu fairly soon. The mouth of the Nyagasanga River is very close to our camp, and I promised the kids that on Saturday morning we'd take them to the beach. They of course laughed at this, but in fact that's exactly what we did. We took them to the mouth of the Nyagasanga River, which is a sandy beach right on the edge of the Zambezi River. The crocodiles of course meant that swimming was a very quick business. Across the river were hippos and crocodiles visibly in sight. So nobody stayed in the water for more than a few minutes. Everything of course done under the watchful eye of Wellington, our National Parks Board guide. The Nyagasanga River itself leading from the hinterland, and we were in its mouth. From the Nyagasanga River we could in fact see across to our camp, and that evening back to one of those magnificent winter Zambezi Valley sunsets. Next day we headed for the hinterland to check out some water holes, because the water holes were still fairly full and the animals were tending to stay inland and not come to the river. So in order to find fresh tracks, one needed to head into the hinterland and check around the water holes. On this particular occasion we were looking for hippo tracks, as Carl at this stage was keen on securing his hippo trophy, and it took quite a lot of hard work before we eventually found hippo in a large pan, and Carl was in fact able to get himself a magnificent hippo bull. It wasn't as easy as one would imagine. It was in fact a very difficult operation, and once the hippo had been shot, it was left for some time for the belly to distend and for it to float, and the vehicles were fetched from camp, the usual thing being chopping of a road through the bush, and eventually we were able to get within reach of the hippo. An Opa and an assistant went out to tie a chain around the hippo, and once this chain was secured, needless to say, everybody was very uneasy about standing in the water with the crocodiles around. The Land Rover was inspanned and pulled this mammoth animal out of the water onto the bank with quite some difficulty. Opa went to great pains to explain to us all the characteristics of a hippo, and it certainly was a fearsome beast. We were very interested to see it so close up. This was in fact the first hippo that Carl had shot, and was his first trophy hippo, and was certainly a worthwhile one. Beautiful ivories. The hippo was also not wasted. It was also cut up into biltong and taken back to camp. On the way back we saw one of the lions that we were to see a lot of during our camp, and this family of lions was in the habit of coming into the camp at night, and we had quite some fun and games with these lions coming right into the outskirts of the camp and trying to get at the meat. This fellow was filmed on the boneyard tearing at the hippo carcass after all the meat had been cut off. The leopard also would visit our camp periodically, and pug marks were found in our camp, and we had baboon on our license, and we actually shot a baboon and hung him up in a tree, and in a very short while the leopard had found him and had eaten the baboon. So we had visitors at night. Another one of the visitors we had that weren't able to film was a pair of honey badgers. Every night the honey badgers visited us. Buffalo hunting again, checking waterhole, and this time in the thick jess, right in the thick jess, I was able to shoot my second buffalo, which was a female. We had a male and a female on the license, and once again a very long cutting of a road following elephant tracks through the jess bush in a roundabout way, following elephant tracks and opening the path up until we could get to the buffalo. This was also a beautiful specimen of a female buffalo, and she made truly delicious eating. Her meat was fat, and we certainly enjoyed her. Nothing was wasted. The meat was all loaded onto the truck and taken back to the camp. On our way back, we saw one of the very interesting sights of the valley, the red-billed curlew finches in their millions, flocks of literally millions of birds taking off and sounding just like a jumbo jet taking off. The next day, the rest of the party went up to Kariba to spend the night there and to see what Lake Kariba was all about. John Naisted has a beautiful boat on the lake, and he went up with them. He was the other member of our party, and they spent 2 days and a night up in Kariba, and we went up and joined them just for the daylight part of the one day. And we certainly enjoyed Caribbean Bay, and we enjoyed having a short exposure to Lake Kariba. On our way back, we stopped again on the escarpment, different time of the day, and just enjoyed looking down onto a valley which was becoming more familiar to us. On our way back, we were waylaid by lions, a pride of lions. The lions certainly seemed to be very prolific and seemed to have bred up quite tremendously in the valley. I was on the back of the open bucky, so there was no way Carl could have forced his way past these lions, and in any case they're known to chew tires and to demolish a vehicle, so we just had to wait very respectfully for these lions to give us the right of way. Eventually back in camp, the rest of the party joined us, and we were able to spend a bit of time there in between hunting trips. Of course, this Zambezi Valley hunting experience is one which means that conservation is alive and the animals are protected in the Zambezi Valley. The auction that I had attended in February had brought in to the game department a figure in excess of 9 million rand for hunts sold. So each of these animals which are shot in the valley are paying for conservation. Without this revenue, there's no ways that the Zimbabwe Conservation, Parks and Wildlife people could patrol the area and keep the poachers out. As it is, the rhino have virtually disappeared, but the elephant are on the increase. So it's just a reinforcement to the old story that conservation must pay, and conservation must be the utilization of renewable natural resources. And in this way, the Zambezi Valley is being utilized to provide money to be plowed back in again for conservation. Our trophy room and our meat room, large amounts of biltong hanging up in the trees, and almost on a daily basis we had the canoe safaris going past down this river. We were particularly interested in this because we had been privileged to do this trip ourselves a few years beforehand from Chirundu to the west of us right down to Kanyemba on the Mozambique border, and we certainly enjoyed the exchanges we had with these people in their canoes as they went past. The morning mists on the river were always quite spectacular, and everybody was pretty warmly dressed, and of course, as usual in a camp like this, the fire was the center and the heart of the whole camp. The beautiful hard wood, making a fire which would just burn for the whole period of the 2 weeks that we were there. The early mist on the river, and a typical hunt now with Carl firing at an impala after a stalk. The impala was heart shot, so one would expect it to be lying exactly where he shot it with a .375 Magnum, but no, typically it wasn't lying there where it had been shot. It was 70 meters away, and it took some very professional tracking by Wellington and by Carl before the animal was found. Heart shot, beautifully placed bullet right through the shoulder and through the heart, and yet that animal ran 70 meters before it fell. Once again, the impala, mainly for camp meat and for biltong. We had 12 impala on our license, males, both males and females, and we were able to shoot 11 of the 12. One of the animals unfortunately was wounded when we didn't recover it. Of course, one of the hazards of hunting in this area at times was the elephant. More often than not, they weren't a problem, but one had to be wary of these animals as they could be quite aggressive at times and could give one quite a nasty scare, as this young bull is about to show us here. The next week we went back to the mouth of the Nyagasanga River for the children to have another swim, but it was not to be on this day, as we found 15 large crocodiles lying on the sand where the children had been swimming the Saturday before. But there was a very good reason for this. The Zambians had poached a hippo which had obviously been eating their grain, their crops, and this hippo, this unfortunate animal, had swum out into the river and had been caught up in a tree. And the smell of this hippo had lured all the crocs in the vicinity, and they were just waiting for the animal to get soft enough for them to be able to break in. John Naisted and his skinning team did a tremendous job of cutting all the animals up into biltong. They took this biltong periodically up, or sent it periodically up to Harare, and were able to cover the costs of the trip with the biltong that they sold in Harare. Once the hunting was over, fishing was the order of the day, and we really enjoyed catching tiger fish and bream. July, by now it was July, our hunt took place at the end of June and the beginning of July. July is not the best month for tiger, but we did nevertheless do quite a bit of fishing during the last few days of our hunt, as our hunting by then was basically over, and we traveled quite long distances up and down this magnificent river. And it really is a large river and is navigable for tremendous distances. And this little aluminium tub that we had was not the most stable, but was nevertheless used to advantage. And we caught some very nice tigers, nothing very large. Michael and John here showing their morning's catch. Michael hooked into a huge tiger which he played very expertly around the boat twice, and we actually saw it very closely and estimated its weight as about 10 pounds before he lost it. It was very, very unfortunate. Then of course all good things come to an end, and so we came to the last evening of our camp. We came to the last night we would spend on the banks of the Zambezi River, and it certainly was with a feeling of sadness that we mentally prepared ourselves for packing the next day. Packing up and then the leaving back via Harare, where we wouldn't spend the night. We would go via the Lion and Elephant Motel and then eventually back to South Africa.
He kept... The boat is getting stuck.